Well, thank you so much for having me here. I've never been to Copenhagen before. I've had a fabulous couple of days just walking and eating my way through the city. I also always love to share my science with broad audiences. I think this topic really lends itself well both to scientific education as well as entertainment. So hopefully we will have some of both tonight. I have been working on this topic of how spaceflight affects human physiology now for about 20 years. So I've been in this business for a long time. My work has been supported by grants from NASA as well as from the National Space Biomedical Research Institute. I know people are probably less familiar with that one. They've just changed their name to Space for Biomedicine, I think just to make it more confusing. And I've been working for them. I've had an administrative role with that institute for the last few years as well, where I am something called their sensorimotor team lead. This means that I coordinate research projects, around 5 to 10 different projects at a time at different universities around the US, all looking at how spaceflight changes the way you move or the way that your brain tries to move your body. So I think this gives me a nice perspective on some of the big picture questions that are being asked. And just to tell you a little bit more about this Space for Biomedicine Institute, they're a little bit different from NASA. Their research is solely focused on challenges of human spaceflight. So they're not so interested in just sending telescopes or satellites or so on. They want to solve problems of human spaceflight. And then they have as another goal of trying to engineer solutions that work in space, but also that improve the health of humans on Earth. So they really have this two-pronged focus. If you're going to someday submit a research grant to them, you have to talk about how does it help people in space and how does it help people on Earth. And although I work in the area of sensorimotor changes, they support lots of different research projects. So it's not just movement that's affected by spaceflight, it's also cardiovascular system, the muscles, the bones, human factors, or the way that we work is different in space. They do a lot of work as well on psychosocial dynamics, which means, if you have a small team of 3 or 4 people and you put them in something the size of a small camper for 6 months or a year, what's going to happen to their ability to work together or interact with each other? They also focus a lot on radiation. Radiation is now thought to be one of the biggest challenges in terms of getting people to Mars. So they do a lot of work on how can you mitigate the health risks of radiation. And then they also have an area called smart medical systems. The work that I do in my lab is not just focused on spaceflight, so it's actually focused much more broadly on this more general topic of how the brain controls movement. And so I also do some work on just looking at how people learn new motor skills, whether you're a novice or an expert. I do some work on Parkinson's disease as well, which is primarily focused towards trying to optimize the way we treat the disease and to improve symptoms in individual patients. And then I also do some work on aging, how age affects brain structure, brain function. What does this mean in terms of balance and motor control? But of course, I don't have time to talk about all of that tonight. You'll maybe have to have me come back again. But tonight, these are the questions that we're going to be focused on. So we're going to talk about what happens to the human body when you send it into microgravity. And why is it different to move your body in space than it is to move your body on Earth? Why is this hard? We're going to look at whether spaceflight changes the brain, and if so, how. And then I'll close by talking about some of the things that we call countermeasures, or ways of reducing these impacts of spaceflight. So what do astronauts do in space so that they come back to Earth in better shape? And these days, NASA is really pushing its focus towards human travel to Mars, okay? Or some other deep space destination. with the idea that we've already been exploring our near atmosphere environment with the International Space Station. We've been to the moon. So what's the next step? The next step is to send someone further out there. And there are still a lot of challenges that need to be solved, because if we're going to do that, people are going to be in space for maybe a couple of years, maybe 3 years. So these problems that we've identified with spaceflight are things that we've seen in people who've gone to space for a few weeks or a few months. We don't know if there are dose-response effects. If we send people all the way to Mars, can they come back? So this is where a lot of their work is being focused right now. And what I want to do is just show you a short video from some of my colleagues at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, because I think the video clip is nice. It really kind of elaborates some of the problems, and I think the music too is really.
One of the many challenges that we face on our mission to Mars is how our brain will adapt to the changes in gravity.
It could take up to 6 months to get there, but here's the problem.
The more time you spend in space, the longer it takes your brain to readapt to gravity.
So what does that mean? Landing on Mars after being weightless for 6 months, you have trouble walking straight.
Your vision is affected.
Poor eye-hand coordination.
Motion sickness.
Dizziness, vomiting.
Some people don't even want to move.
Landing is one of the most critical aspects of the journey.
So how will this impact our trip to Mars? First of all, landing on Mars will require good eye-hand coordination and perception.
So, say you have a safe touchdown.
But there's an emergency situation and you have to exit the vehicle.
If you can't function, it could be a pretty dangerous situation.
This is just one of the human challenges we'll face on a mission to Mars.
We don't have all the answers yet, but we do have the key.
The International Space Station.
Every day aboard, we're learning more and more about how our bodies adapt to weightless environments and gravitational transitions.
We're going to Mars.
It won't be easy, but because of the research that we're doing today on the ground and aboard the International Space Station, we'll be ready.
Yeah. So it sounds very empowering, doesn't it? Yeah. But like I said, still some issues to solve. But the idea is that we're able to use the International Space Station as basically a research laboratory for what might happen to someone if we send them into space for a couple of years. You may know Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko just returned from 1 year in space, and these poor guys are being measured in I don't know how many dozens of different experiments with the idea of looking at what's going on with their physiology. How different is it from someone who just went for 6 months? Do they recover at the same rate? Do they have more problems, or is it about the same? So let me just illustrate with an example. This graph shows how bone and muscle are affected by spaceflight. So if you take a look here, just look at bone, where the triangle symbols show how much bone mass you lose if you're on long-duration bed rest. For example, if you're a patient with a spinal cord injury or some other reason for being on bed rest, so this is over 100 weeks of time, you can lose about 1/3 of your bone mass. But if you look at spaceflight, if you're out there that long as well, you can lose half of your bone density from being in space, okay? So you may have heard about astronauts exercising for 2 hours a day while they're in space. The British astronaut Tim Peake just ran the London Marathon in space, and this is why, okay? They also take Fosamax to help maintain some of their bone density, but really there are dramatic losses even when you're exercising a couple of hours a day. And clearly there's a dose-response effect here. The longer you're in space, the more dramatic the effects. But one thing that has not really been looked at is what happens to the brain in space, okay? We have flown rodents in space on Neurolab, and those animals came back with structural changes in their brain. There were differences in the number of connections between different nerve cells in the brain. There were changes in the structure of cells in the brain. But at this point, we don't really know what happens to the human brain. So we are currently running experiments to measure brain structure, brain function, and sensorimotor control before and after people go to space. And what I'll do tonight is tell you a little bit about what we think is happening in the brain, and I'll show you some preliminary results from these experiments. But first, let's think about why might it be different to move in space? Why is it so different? I mean, we look at these people, gosh, they look like they're having a great time, right? They're floating around. It looks like everything's pretty easy, but it's actually very different to control the movement of your body and even to maintain spatial orientation when you're in microgravity. And this sounds very obvious, but there are differences between moving with gravity and being without gravity. And gravity, is basically a force that is pulling objects together, right? So if we're standing on Earth, gravity is still pulling us towards the center of the planet. But we don't fall into the center of the planet, right? There's the surface of the Earth that's stopping us from doing that. So instead, we experience the pull of gravity as the weight of our bodies, okay? If you are on the International Space Station and you're orbiting the Earth, that station is essentially in a controlled fall. It's being pulled towards the center of the Earth, and so is your body. And there's no, surface of the Earth there to stop you, which in this case is probably a good thing. And so you're in basically a free fall, and this is what makes it seem like you are weightless while you're on the International Space Station. So let me just show you a video clip of some people moving in space or moving in an environment where they do not feel weight on their bodies. I think this will be obvious. And this is some older footage. It's from Skylab, but I think it's really nice. So let me see here, actually. Where is my... Hold on just a second. I'm going to do this a little bit. Differently. Okay. Oh, I don't want to start it from the beginning. I'm just going to show you this one slightly smaller. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at this guy. He's in microgravity, and oh my goodness, push-ups are so easy, right? They're so easy that you can do them with one of your friends on your back. And they're so easy that you can actually do them with two of your friends on your back. Because these bodies don't weigh anything, why not? Let's do them one-handed. Let's see how easy that is. Okay? And so easy that you can even do no-handed push-ups, okay? So don't try this at home. But here are some other video as well from Skylab, and I think this really looks incredible, right? You can see that even just a tiny touch against the wall can send you flying to the other side of the vehicle, okay? And you see them spinning around, doing somersaults, flips, running upside down, okay? So this gives you an idea of what it looks like. But I want to talk a little bit about why this is different and why it's actually challenging for the brain to move in space. Okay. So now I have this funny picture up here with candy, and this is to remind me that this is the time in my presentation when I'm going to give out some fabulous prizes, by which I mean candy. So I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions throughout the talk, and my wonderful assistant back here, Julian, will help me to hand out some candy that looks like astronauts or the space shuttle. So it's a little hard for me to see you, but can someone raise their hand? Can you tell me, what is one sensory system that we rely on when we're moving our body? Okay, right here. Oh, the cochlea. Okay, so this is related to hearing. So sure, you could rely on hearing. But you can give him a candy. Okay. Okay, vestibular system. Oh my goodness, that's very advanced answer. What else besides the vestibular system? Right here. Eyes, vision. Okay, can you give her one too, please? What else? Ooh, way over here. Okay, balance. Can you give it another word? Balance. Oh, she's not quite sure, but you can give her candy anyways. Yeah. Proprioception. Wow, these people know everything. Okay, great. So there are numerous sensory systems that we rely on for movement. And I think a lot of people are aware of like these 5 main senses, right? So taste, sight, smell, touch, and sound. But there are actually more than those that you rely on for movement. So we had vestibular system, which is also often called your sense of balance. We heard proprioceptive system. And I'll talk a little bit about how these change with flight. But one point I want to make is that even if only one of these changed, it still is going to affect how you view the world, how you move your body, and that's because usually your brain interprets all of these sources of sensory information together to form this sort of coherent percept of where your body is in space, where your limbs are relative to the rest of the body. Are you right side up? Are you upside down? Who's near you? Where's the object that you want to pick up? So, okay, time for another piece of candy. Someone said vestibular system. What is the vestibular system? What is it? Does anybody want to tackle that one? What is it? No takers for a piece of space candy? Okay. Oh, she already got one, but that's okay. You can try it. Oh, you didn't? Oh, okay, go ahead. Oh, system of vestibules. Okay. Well, that might be worth a piece of candy, but maybe we should also try another answer. Great. So she's talking about this system in your inner ear, that it has some sort of like thick fluid in it that moves with the effect of gravity. So sometimes the vestibular system is even called your sense of gravity. It's actually found here in your inner ear, behind the eardrum. So here's the cochlea. It looks like a snail that's involved in hearing. And the vestibular system is then made up of these semicircular canals, which 3 of them that are at right angles to each other, and then something called the otoliths in the middle, which has this almost like jello stuff in it and some little calcium carbonate crystals. And so she was saying these things move around with gravity. So if you all just take a moment and tilt your left ear towards your shoulder, okay? There are little stones that are getting pulled around in your vestibular system. You can pick your head up now. By gravity. And as these stones get pulled around, they basically bend these little hair cell receptors that are in your inner ear, and they depolarize and start sending signals to your brain saying, hey, the head is tilted over. Okay? So part of this works on linear and angular accelerations, right? If you were to do a flip, you would also send some of this fluid spinning around in the vestibular system, and your brain would say, yeah, okay, that was an acceleration. But part of it works based on gravity, okay? So you can imagine this is maybe something that changes with flight, and we'll talk about how in just a minute. Okay, someone else said proprioception. So for a piece of candy, what is proprioception? Oh, okay. What it?
It's the sense of your body in relation. Like if I close my eyes, I know I touch my heel, for example.
Sure.
I call that my proprioception.
You're right. For a piece of candy. So proprioception is your sense of where your body is in space. So we can all do a very short experiment to demonstrate that you have proprioception and it works. So don't do this yet. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to do this with your eyes closed. What I will ask you to do is kind of, relax your hand a little bit and then just put it into some posture. But close your eyes first and do that. Okay, maybe I should have told you to put down your drink first. What I want you to do is keep your eyes closed, hold your hand in that posture, and now try to match it with your left hand. And open your eyes and look. Do your hands match? At least roughly, okay? For people who didn't have too many cocktails yet, maybe. So you can do that because of proprioception, right? You don't need vision to tell you that, your hand's over here or like this or like this. It's proprioception. So proprioception is made up of little sensors that are in your muscles and your joints. And they are used to sensing the weight of your body. And the weight of your body has weight because of gravity, okay? So in space, I don't know if you remember one of the early pictures of the 3 astronauts that were standing together. The woman was not standing with her arms by her sides. She was standing with her arms like this, right? They're floating because they don't have weight, okay? So your proprioceptive system is also very much affected by being in space. And vision is affected as well. I think most people know what the visual system is and how it's important for movement. A lot of times you might look at where your drink is and you want to pick it up. So vision is used quite heavily for movement. So again, let's think about, what happens to these sensory systems and your ability to move your body when you're in space? And I'm going to share with you a couple of findings from my research, but I first want to tell you that this work is somewhat difficult to do, right? We have only a handful of people that go up to space every year. So imagine I'm doing an experiment where I'm measuring sensory processing and movement and balance, and I'm looking at the brain before people go up to space and when they get back. And they're going to be gone for 6 months or a year, and there's only a few people that go every year. So this is a very slow experiment. And because of this, NASA really likes what they call analog environments, okay? So by that, they mean environments that are similar to space. For example, if they want to study team dynamics, they will do experiments on people that are wintering over at an Antarctic field station. They're stuck there with the same small group of people for maybe 4 or 6 months, and you can't leave until winter's over. It's physically impossible. So this sounds a lot like maybe 4 or 5 people in the International Space Station for 6 months, and they can't leave unless there's an emergency, and even then it's going to take a long time to get them down. So Arctic field stations are one spaceflight analog environment, but I'm going to tell you about a different one, which is long-duration bedrest, okay? And you might at first say, sure, sign me up for that. I'll go to bed for a while in the sake of science. But they are putting people in bed for 2 months. 2 months. And what they've done is they take the head and they tilt it below the feet by about 5 degrees. And that mimics this shift in body fluids that happens in space, like a lot of your blood and other fluids moves up to your head without gravity to pull it down. And these people do not get up for anything, by which I mean anything. They use a supine shower. They use a bedpan to go to the bathroom. They're allowed to prop up their head with their hand during each meal for about 5 minutes a day so they don't choke on their food, okay? So if you're interested in hearing more about this, this is actually, there was a blog from someone who was in one of our bedrest campaigns, and I particularly like it because he posted a photo of himself wearing some of the equipment that we use to measure vestibular processing, and he didn't make it sound too terrible. But you imagine, okay, while these people are in bed rest, they're getting paid a lot of money, and they're participating in a lot of experiments, okay? So while they're there, they might be participating in 15 or 20 different experiments. This is like their full-time job. They're just getting measured all day long, okay? So let's come back to this fluid shift thing that I mentioned earlier. So if you look at these three people, this is for a piece of candy, by the way. Can you tell me which one of these people is right side up and why? Who's right side up? Okay. All of them? All or none of them? Okay, that's pretty much the right answer. So if you called out all of them or none of them, you can have a piece of candy because those are both right. Okay? These people are only staying in this orientation if you take a look at them. They have their feet under different foot loops, okay? And that's what's keeping them in place. And if you look around them, you'll see there's equipment on every wall, or what you and I might call the floor or the ceiling. And that's because there is no up or down in space. It's gravity that gives us this perception of up and down, okay? In fact, when people go up in space, they will report that they have some interesting illusions where, this guy might say, okay, I was working with this electronics equipment, and for a while I felt like I was right side up. And then all of a sudden, just like that, I felt like I was upside down. And then I didn't feel like I was oriented in any way at all. And again, that's the brain getting used to these altered vestibular inputs, so there's no gravitational pull on them. But let's come back to this idea of fluids. So how do you think this affects the fluid distribution in the body? Raise your hand for a piece of candy. Yeah. It evens it out, right. So he can have a piece of candy. So imagine gravity is pulling our blood and other fluids down towards our feet. And the reason that we don't just walk around with these, giant piles of blood and water in our feet is because our cardiovascular systems have these interesting valves, right, that stop stuff from going down. It can only go up in some cases, or it can partially go up in some cases. So the body has evolved in a way that the fluid is distributed evenly throughout the body. You go up in space, you see sometimes photos of people with this kind of puffy face, and in the last couple of years, NASA has identified a sensorimotor control problem that they think is related to this fluid shift and puffy face, which is roughly 1 out of 5 astronauts are coming back with a change in visual acuity. And if you look at an MRI scan of their eye, normally the back of the eye, like the eyeball, the globe is round, right? But they're coming back with the back of the eye is flattened, almost as if there's increased ocular pressure pushing the eye out a little bit in its socket. And it's the back of the eye where light focuses, and you stimulate the different photoreceptors in the back of the eye, and that's how we see the world around us. So imagine if you're changing the shape of the back of the eye, it's going to change your vision fairly dramatically. So if we think about this bedrest analog environment, there are some features of spaceflight that we're mimicking and some that we're not. One that we're mimicking is this change in proprioception, right? We're unloading the body because people are lying in bed and they're not getting up. We're not affecting the vestibular system, though, right? Gravity is still there. It's still pulling down on us. It's still stimulating the vestibular system, every time you're allowed to prop up your head to eat. But we're also mimicking this fluid shift issue, right? Because we've put the head below the feet. And so these people in this bed rest environment also have their fluid up towards their head, okay? So we have been doing experiments, both in bed rest and in spaceflight, where we're collecting the same measures with the idea that where we see similar changes between the two environments, it could be from fluid shift, it could be from body unloading, it could be from isolation, but it's probably not due to vestibular changes, right? Those are going to be specific to spaceflight and the absence of gravity. So being able to work in these two environments gives us a better ability to interpret any changes in the brain or sensory motor behavior that we see with flight. Also, one thing that is another thing that's unique to the spaceflight environment and not bedrest is this space motion sickness, right? So remember I asked you to tilt your head over, and you can tell from your vision and proprioception in your neck that you've tilted your head, but you also get this gravity pulling the stones around in your inner ear. Well, now imagine you're in space and you tilt your head over, and you can see that you've tilted your head, you can feel it with the proprioceptors in your neck, but now your brain is not getting this information from the vestibular system. And now you have conflicting sensory inputs. And the way the brain responds to that, particularly if vestibular system is involved, is that it makes you feel really sick. So when people first go to space, they tend to have space motion sickness. And this can last for several days. So when people first go up, they are not asked to do something right away. Like they won't do a spacewalk on their first day. They won't, pick something up with the robotic arm. And not only does this affect you when you go up to space, it also affects you when you come back down. So you've been spending 6 months where your brain has not been getting this information from the vestibular system about tilt, and suddenly you're back on Earth and you tilt your head and your brain says, oh my gosh, what just happened? And so people get sick when they come back as well. The sickness might not last that long, but you need quite a bit of time to readapt the vestibular system and how the brain interprets that information for balance and things like that. So here's how we've been studying this. We are doing lots of different measurements of spatial orientation and of balance. So we put people on this balance platform, and the platform can tilt while you're standing on it. We can also have this sort of visual curtain around you that moves as you move. So we can cause different types of sensory conflict, or we can put people on here and ask them to tilt their head around while they're on here, which is very provocative stimulation when they come back from flight. We also measure manual coordination, and then we put them in an MRI scanner to measure what's going on with brain structure and brain function, and we try to relate these two types of data together. So let's start with balance. If I have you standing on this balance platform and it tilts a little bit, but you're not moving your head, this is data from lots of different astronauts. So here's their balance scores before they go into space, and 100 would be a perfect score on this test. So people are doing pretty well. There's certainly some variability. Some people have better balance than others, but they're all doing pretty well. Now we bring them back from space. So this is their days post-flight from 0 out to 10. And you can see that they're definitely having some trouble with this test, but they readapt, by about day 4 or 5, they're doing better. But now let's look at what happens in this other graph. So this is what happens when we put them on, not only put them on the plate, but ask them to tilt their head around. And it's really hard. There are a lot of these dots that are down here at 0, which means they couldn't do it. They start tilting their head and they had to step off the plate, or they had to grab onto a railing for support. And it's taking them a long time to recover to where they were pre-flight, okay? It's taking them about 10 days just to be able to balance on this plate and move their head around the same way that they used to before they went to space. And that's because of this ability or this need for the brain to readapt to getting vestibular inputs, okay? It doesn't happen immediately. It happens over kind of a long period of time. And if we look at bedrest, we also see something similar. So these data points here in blue are balance scores for people that are just walking around, going about their daily lives. And the points in red are those poor, unlucky people that are in bedrest for 70 days. So if this is their balance score before they go on bedrest, they're way down here when they come out. And again, they don't recover immediately. It can take them up to about 2 weeks 2 weeks of walking around and living their daily life and engaging in physical therapy to learn how to control their balance again. So there are some parallels here with what we see with flight. So bed rest, 2 months of bed rest changes the brain. What I'm showing here is the regions in blue are showing decreases in gray matter volume, and those in orange are showing increases in gray matter volume. And I don't want you to look at the blue and say, oh my gosh, I just laid around in bed all weekend. Did I lose a ton of gray matter? Not really, not really. So this is not neuronal cell death. These measures really instead tend to reflect things like number of connections between different nerve cells, also some different types of fluid and neurotrophic factors in the brain. But the other thing I want to point out to you about these data is that if you were kind of to draw an arrow from this point with the most amount of gray matter loss to this point with the highest amount of gray matter gain, you could see that there's kind of this shift towards the back of the head. And what we think is happening, again, these people are in bed with their head below their feet. This seems to be like a shift of the brain towards the back of the skull. And it's not just a short-term shift, like as soon as you stand up, it doesn't fall back into place. These effects last for somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks for bed rest. For flight, we see something slightly similar. I'll show you in a minute. And we don't know how long they last with flight. So some of these changes that we see with bed rest seem to come from this fluid shift, maybe, like the fluid shifting upwards in the body, and also the effect of gravity, just kind of pulling the brain towards the back of the skull. But there also seems to be some evidence for neuroplastic changes or something more like adaptation. And we see this effect particularly in brain regions that are involved with controlling movement of the lower limbs of the body and processing sensory inputs from the lower limbs of the body. And the reason we think this is adaptive is that if you are someone who shows more gray matter increase in these areas, you are also someone who shows less declines in balance. Okay? So the brain is somehow trying to adapt to these unloading or disuse of the limbs. It's doing something different in terms of these regions of the brain that control the lower limbs. And the more you do that, the less impaired you are when you come out of bed rest. So we also have some data from flight subjects. And you may remember that I said it's really hard to collect these data with astronauts. So these are not data from my study yet. We're still collecting data. These MRI scans were actually done on astronauts as part of like a health checkup. So they gave them a scan sometime before they went to space and when they came back. So it's really not a controlled experiment. We don't have measures of brain function, just measures of brain structure. But we see something very similar to what I showed you with bed rest, which is that there's a lot of gray matter loss in these frontal areas and kind of in a ring around the lower part of the brain, almost as if you could imagine like fluid is shifting upwards and pushing the brain up in the head a little bit. But then we also, on top of that, seem to get, again, something that might be more of an adaptive change. So gray matter increases specifically in the parts of the brain that control the lower limbs. Okay? So if there are big changes in balance and in the brain, what can we do about it? Well, I've already mentioned that the astronauts are exercising for about 2 hours a day in space. Okay? Don't worry, it's not quite as intense as we might do here on Earth. So if you look at this woman who's running on the treadmill, she actually needs a pretty elaborate bungee system to just keep her on the treadmill, because otherwise she would step on it and she would just go floating off. So they use a bungee system to kind of hold themselves into place and to give a little bit of loading to the muscles and the bones. There are also some very highly engineered weight training systems, so people can do deadlifts, squats, bicep curls, etc., without the whole system also going flying off around the space station. But one thing that they are not doing is they're not practicing their balance, right? They're not doing anything that modifies vestibular inputs. So one thing that people have been talking about doing is trying to introduce some sort of balance challenge where you might be kind of having to balance on a rocker board while you're doing your weight training. You still would have to be bungeed down, but that still is not going to impact the vestibular system. So people are also talking again about artificial gravity. If you spin people when they're in space, you can introduce an acceleration and a loading on the muscles, the bones, and you can send vestibular signals to the brain. But this is complicated. You would have to send some very heavy, very large equipment into space to get this to work, and we still don't really know if it's going to solve all the problems. Now, coming back to Earth, I mentioned, can be really hard, too. Your brain has learned learned how you can exist in microgravity without feeling this space motion sickness all the time. And suddenly you're back, and you're getting these vestibular signals related to gravity again, and you have to readapt. Sometimes people have something called a tilt translation illusion, which is really interesting. So you tilt your head, remember we talked about ear to your shoulder, and your brain's not used to getting these tilt signals, but it's been used to processing signals about linear accelerations. So when you come back from space and you tilt your head, a lot of people have an illusion that they have either rushed forward or rushed backward in space. You can imagine it's pretty disorienting and destabilizing. People can fall. And, for other various reasons, coming back to Earth can be hard. This is Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, who flew in space a few years ago. He was the one who played the guitar and did a lot of Twitter while he was up there. When they came back, this is kind of a sign of how hard their capsule hit the Earth, right? He stayed in there along with the rest of his crew for half an hour. Half an hour, they couldn't get up. They were so disoriented, having so much trouble, they couldn't get out until people came to help them. And you may have seen some of these kinds of photos where after return, the astronauts are carried in these chairs, with sort of a blanket on them. And you might think, oh, that's nice, people are carrying them. Well, it's not that it's nice, it's that most of them cannot walk. And it's not so much because of bone mass and reduced muscle strength, it's more this disorienting vestibular problem. So now imagine what might happen if you had to land in water. So sometimes there are water landings. Or imagine you land on Mars and maybe there's a fire and there's nobody to help you get out. You have to get yourself out, and you have to get yourself out quickly. So it's reasons like this why NASA and other space agencies are really interested in how can we help people adapt faster when they're going through a gravitational environment change, and what can they do to reduce risks. And just to give you a little feel for how long it takes people to recover, I said it can take maybe 10 days to improve your performance on this balance test, and on average it can take about 3 weeks for people to really fully cover their mobility. So astronauts are not allowed to drive their car for about 3 weeks when they get back. Again, what's going to happen with this Mars rover? No one will be able to drive it for a while. It can take about 6 months to recover your muscle mass, about a year to recover your bone density to what it was before you went in space, and that's even if you're exercising 2 hours a day while you're up there. And again, we don't really know very much at all about how the brain changes, and we know nothing about recovery time. So these are still kind of important, outstanding questions, and I'll just leave you with a couple of them. These are things, some of the questions that I'm working on in my research and questions that other space scientists at Johnson Space Center are working on. So one is can we facilitate the adaptation process before we ever send people into space? Okay, there's a lot of training that's done, like in a giant pool at Johnson Space Center, the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. People are looking at other ways of trying to facilitate adaptation before people go to space. We also would like to know, can we predict ahead of time who might be better at this than others? Not necessarily to select astronauts, they're selected based on lots of other factors, but rather, if we know who might have more trouble, we can think about ways to support them, whether it's with additional training or additional motion sickness treatments, or we know who should or should not be asked to drive the rover when we get to Mars. And then there's also this question of, can we do anything for the vestibular system while we're in microgravity? Given that it works with gravity, this remains kind of an important challenge. So I will stop there, but I do want to just acknowledge my helping hands, if you will. So this kind of work takes a ton of people, it takes good funding sources, and these are some of the people that work with me in my laboratory and at Johnson Space Center. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions.